to talk about a new book that I have actually been published in, Secondary English for Generation Alpha, edited by Lorna Smith, who is the PGC lead at Bristol University and an associate professor there, and someone I've known for quite a long time. I did my teacher training with her back in Cambridge in the very late 1980s, early 90s. And she's edited a wonderful book, which has got full of interesting chapters, which I have one in, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we have basically focused chapters on areas to do with Generation Alpha, who are defined very helpfully by Lorna as Generation Alpha are those born between approximately 2010 and 2025. And the name Alpha, she points out, is very apt because it's the root of alphabet. And there are some really useful, interesting chapters in the book about how this generation might best be taught English. Ruth and Marn on dialogue in the English classroom, Ian Cushing, who has led the way in a lot of research around this issue of linguistic justice and what's going on in schools around particularly how children of colour are treated by the current system. And he doesn't really mince his words, sort of saying that essentially much of the English curriculum, particularly as it is now in schools, has a sort of racist undercurrent. Part 2 is on interpreting literature. I should say part 1 is speaking and listening, 2 chapters there, and some interesting chapters on how we make meaning together, how drama-based pedagogy and reading in secondary English classroom work by Sue Pinnock. Julie Blake, who heads up Poetry Aloud, which promotes spoken word poetry in the across the country, has a chapter on poetry in the moment. And then part 3 is exploring non-fiction, literary non-fiction in the post-truth era curriculum, by John Perry, who was part of a group. I used to be a member of the initial teacher education group of Nate. He may well still be, but I've stepped away from that. We have a chapter on from the perspective of trees, developing students' eco and socio-critical literacies with non-fiction texts. Part 4 is on fostering writing, hands-on, using Playbox to support teachers develop racial literacy through workshops and personal writing by Lorna Smith. So sort of a modern sort of digital technology. And my own chapter, 4 ways personal language autobiographies can transform the English teaching of Generation Alpha. And a chapter on creating collaborative poetry anthology. And finally, Annabelle Watson on metalinguistic knowledge and writing development, and that's the sort of language around grammar, essentially what we might describe grammar and what works best. Of course, there's been this huge focus around children learning grammatical terms, particularly in primary schools. You know, they're fronted on verbials, and sad to say, I think that Annabelle Watson's and Deborah Myhill's research doesn't particularly endorse this approach, although this modern approach has in part been taken from some of their research. So I look forward to reading that chapter, as I look forward to reading all of these chapters. My own chapter is really about how we can help young people draw on their funds of knowledge in the English classroom by getting them to think seriously about how they came to learn language, the sorts of language they like, and shape a kind of autobiography around their language learning, which I've found can be, it's quite a tricky task, but it's a really, really helpful task to do. So I call it a personal language autobiography, PLA. So the key points I make are that point one, the PLA, or the personal language autobiography, turns students into experts of their languages. And I point out the kind of history of this, because doing a personal language autobiography was actually something that was very commonly done by English teachers in the 1980s and 1990s when I first started training, but has fallen out of fashion, or isn't developed anymore, because there's a much bigger emphasis on children learning grammatical terms. And I point out that the personal language autobiography can be used to teach grammar, so you can get people to think about the important nouns in their lives, like mummy, or words that, you know, such as mummy, or objects, you know, the kitchen table, the kind of noun phrase, or whatever it is. And I point out also that the personal language autobiography improves students' creative and critical skills, and it's also because it improves their critical skills, because they start to think reflectively about the effects of language on them, and the language that means things to them. So the phrases that they really like, or the phrases that really hurt them, the adjectives like stupid, or a noun like idiot, might really upset someone. And children, in my experience, start to reflect upon the power of language and the emotional effect it has in a very real way when they write their personal language autobiography. The final point I make is that it is a very good teacher education tool, because if you get English teachers writing their own personal language autobiography, which I've done many times, they start to realise this themselves, and the power of getting people to draw on their funds of knowledge, which is a concept developed in the 1990s and 2000s from various researchers in Mexico and South America, where they realized that people learn best about language and writing and literacy, what we call literacy skills, when they start to talk about their homes and what's important to them, the things that they know about their funds of knowledge. And English teachers learn this important pedagogical point when they start to do it for themselves and write their own personal language autobiography. So I'd strongly recommend you to buy this book. Well done, Lorna, for putting it together. Look forward to reading more of the chapters. Having a scan through now, it looks amazing. Thank you.